If you're an alcoholic or you've grown up with an alcoholic parent or you know of someone who's an alcoholic, you really need to watch this. A new research done by NIMHANS Bangaluru says that children of alcoholics are more stressed than other kids. Chemically, this means they show an abnormal level of steroids in the saliva while doing any task. And it's not just the physical, mental and emotional stress. Children of alcoholics undergo genetic changes. What exactly are these? And to tell us more is Dr. Sanjeev Jain. He's a psychiatrist and professor at NIMHANS Bangaluru, someone who's been instrumental in this research. Thank you very much for joining us on Zen-Brain. Simply put, how does it cause physical stress in a child of an alcoholic?
What we've tried to understand with this is by interviewing 50 children who have a parent with alcoholism, usually the father, is that when they're given even the simplest of tasks, all of us get tense during an exam. Children even more so. So you just give them a simple task like doing something like a public speaking, and you detect the amount of cortisol in the saliva every few minutes. And the way this climbs up and goes down indicates how long the stress is experienced. And we find that children who have had parents with alcohol problems show a very different pattern of both the cortisol upswing and how long it stays in the saliva, thereby indicating that they have some memory or something is different in the way they respond to stress in a very different way. Now this can have very marked effects on the brain and the body because prolonged exposure to steroids. I mean, we all need the rush when we are anxious, but if we are too anxious for too long, that has a detrimental effect on our brains, minds and bodies. So what we've done in this study is that we've used multiple levels of data. We've taken the history of exposure to adverse events in childhood. We've looked at how the cortisol is secreted in this, and we've also done a blood test to show how the so-called epigenetics is altered in these individuals. Now, epigenetics is a relatively new branch of research, because to understand how genes are regulated during life.
Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris from California, she's now the Surgeon General in a California hospital, and she talks about how your body responds to a bear in the forest. You're releasing those chemicals in your body so that the body is equipped to fight that stress. Coming home to stress every day is like encountering a bear every day.
Exactly. Stress is necessary as a motivational factor to do anything, but too much stress inhibits action and actually produces paralysis. So to use the same bear analogy, some people get terrified and frozen, and some people run away. Some people try to figure out strategies. But which one of those responses is going to occur depends a lot on your prior experience of having stress. Whether you get frozen and incapable of making any rational decision or choices, you will also be governed by that factor in which your persona has now learned to adapt to this sudden appearance of a bear. As she points out, if that is too constant a phenomenon, then your capacity to make the right decision at the right time may be altered.
Hampered.
Yeah.
Coming back to the research, growing up with an alcoholic parent also causes physical changes to the brain.
Yes. So this is a series of research done predominantly by my colleague Vivek Benegal, who's been following up children of alcoholics for a long time. And even if you use very simple parameters like EEG or MRI, it shows that the brain reacts differently to stimuli. The EEG matures more slowly. The brain shows evidence of altered brain sizes in critical parts of the brain, which is subtly different in children of alcoholics compared to the others. By age, it's a little different. It's not as if it's very bad or damaging, but it is slightly different, and it takes a longer time for the brains to mature to the levels which we expect in adults of 2022. What we have done in this paper is added on a genetic component to this, because although you can observe these changes in the brain, you have no idea as to how these have been produced. And now by using genetics, you can actually figure out how cells and every cell of your body technically gets altered by these processes, so that there are changes in different tissues of the body. As psychiatrists, we are mainly concerned with the brain. So our focus is on understanding how the brain and the mind gets altered by all this. But it could ostensibly be that almost many parts of the body are altered, which is why you find that children who have had a lot of stress actually get more prone to diseases of a general kind as they grow older. It's not just psychiatric or psychological disease.
Doc, coming back to the physical changes in the brain, it also says that it affects your prefrontal cortex, right? Which is an area for learning, so inhibits your learning. What else? Give us more details about this.
So the way the brain reacts to emotions or to fear is that there are different parts of the brain. One is the limbic system, which is basically the hippocampus and the amygdala, which modulate the amount of anxiety response. And the learning occurs in the prefrontal cortex. The balance of chemicals and connectivity between these two areas then governs what you learn. After all, every emotion is a learning experience. But if there's too much emotionality, if there's too much fear, anxiety, then learning becomes aversive. You learn to avoid those situations. Right. So all our learning has to occur on a substrate of either calmness or emotionality, or it has given emotional labels all the time. Now, in children who are now, a growing child's brain is very, very plastic. After all, the brain is the biggest part of the body when we are born, but it becomes even larger by the time you're 12 or 13. Okay, so the brain is very, very plastic when in the first 10 or 12 years of life, and it's constantly learning new ways of learning itself. Now, when that happens, when the amygdala and the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex get trapped into an abnormal kind of circuitry, then that is what the template will be produced by the time you're adolescent. And that is a template which will then persist throughout your life. So it subtly changes that whole, regulatory aspects of how emotions, learning, and things like that are going to happen. And we've been able to find traces of that with almost every measure that we have studied, the EEG and the MRI. We show, for example, that the corpus callosum is different, that is the fibers which connect the different parts of the brain. The prefrontal cortex is slightly different. So all these things have been in a series of papers that my colleagues have been looking at. We can detect these changes in children of alcoholics.
Wow. I bet an alcoholic didn't know that, and the impact that they're having on their children. This puts the kids of alcoholics at high risk of getting psychiatric illnesses.
As a statistic, yes. As the risks are higher, but we don't know, we cannot predict with certainty as to whether a given child is at higher risk.
Because kids who could be facing toxic stress at home could also have loving caregivers otherwise, right?
Oh yes,
that
yes.
can sort of balance it as well. So we are not saying, you're not
Absolutely.
saying all children of
Absolutely.
alcoholics will go through this.
Absolutely. So this was something that was observed half a century or more ago when they, in the West they had these elaborate adoption programs. So if both parents were dysfunctional, were alcoholics, the children could be taken up into foster care homes. And they found that the genetic risk for alcoholism could be significantly altered if the foster parents were very different and they provided a very different caring environment and a more abstinent or a more moderate kind of lifestyle. The genetic influence of having parents with alcoholism could be significantly reduced with that. It's the combination of the genes, the environment, the response of the environment to behaviors. It's a whole series of steps which then tips you over the edge.
There was a research done in the US in the mid-90s which clearly states that there is a link between adverse childhood experiences like having an alcoholic parent to illnesses like heart disease, even lung cancer.
We don't have studies of that nature in India as yet, to the best of my knowledge. But we do find, there are a series of other papers which show that the link between, let's say, early life malnutrition or early life poverty or early life stress does increase the chances of childhood obesity and metabolic syndromes in adult life from India. Okay, so we don't have the detailed study about cancers and things like that, but we do have studies on asthma and on metabolic syndrome, which is hypertension, diabetes. So the fact that the first, let's say, first 10 or 12 years of the child's life are going to carry the imprints of the stress, whether it's nutritional stress, whether it's emotional stress, whether it's the stress of recurrent mild infections or of anemia, these will program the body to have a different trajectory in adult life. I mean, as societies get more complex and at the same time more fragmented, these issues of stress during childhood keeps on morphing itself into more and more complex patterns, and that is really a big challenge for us.
Let's move into the area of epigenetics. That's what you specialize in
Right.
also. Tell us a little bit about epigenetics and how it is impacted in the case of children of alcoholics in this paper.
Right. So epigenetics is an understanding of how genes control the way a body works throughout life. After all, our genetics is fixed at the point of conception. But the same genetic material now has to work with different levels of efficiency or fidelity for 80 years. So genes are not static entities. We understand that, we think that we've understood the genetic code 20 years ago and that's the end of it. But that's not the end of it, because the genetic code now we have to learn how the genetic code itself is controlled.
Would I be right in saying that it may not alter your DNA,
Right.
but it has an impact
Right.
on your genes? It impacts the gene in a way that it performs or does not perform to its optimum.
So that's what I was coming to. So the genetic code that we are born with is going to express itself in different ways given the different kinds of environments our bodies are exposed to throughout our life. It can be as simple a thing as temperature. So our gene expression changes with the weather, or if we go to the Arctic Circle, it will react in a very different way. But all the way down, it will also react differently to nutrition and to emotional stress and to everything that goes on around us. Because all our organs are exquisitely tuned to the environment. We feel hungry, we feel thirsty, we feel happy, we feel sad, depending on our environmental cues. So the genes have to constantly interact with the environment. And the environment, therefore, has a huge role in influencing how the genes themselves are expressed. And epigenetics is a way to understand that. So with particular kinds of changes in the body or in the mind, the genes that control chemicals that influence anxiety, for example, serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter which we know controls mood, anxiety, sleep, the expression of that in critical parts of the brain may get altered by stress so that your brain does not react or changes the way it reacts to stress over time. And understanding these particular mechanisms has now become very important because we then can understand how specific pathways or specific processes in the body are altered by stress of varying kinds. So this study, we looked only at the serotonin transporter, which controls the way the serotonin is released and absorbed in the brain. And we were able to show that the methylation, so that's a change which occurs so-called upstream of the gene and regulates how the gene is going to be expressed, was altered in these children. So these are studies done in the blood, but the assumption is that if this has occurred in one tissue, it would have also occurred in the other.
So excessive release of cortisol over a long period of time impacts genetics?
We don't know. We don't know which is the chicken and which is the egg in this case.
Okay.
So is the abnormal cortisol happening because the brain is responding differently to anxiety and the epigenetic changes have already occurred in the brain, or is the cortisol producing that? We don't know that.
So we don't know which one comes first, but both are impacted.
Both are impacted. So that's because once we begin to understand that process, then we can intervene or we can learn how to alter one or the other in a specific way so that this cycle is interrupted. Because once the cycle is established, it will keep on repeating itself.
So this is the reason why we began Zen-Brain in the first place.
Right.
It's never too late to rewire.
Absolutely.
So you can get rid of that story. You can tell another story.
Right.
And so my question to you, as a researcher is how do you rewrite that?
Yes, so that is the future of psychiatry, or the future of so-called brain science in general, because one must realize that although we have 3 billion nerve cells and millions, quadrillions of synapses, and we lose them at around 2 million cells a day from the time we are 18 or 19. So the brain effectively has a certain use by date, which is probably around 20. And after that, most of us...
We just stop thinking.
After that, we are on a very slow glide down.
Right.
But what happens is that what the brain loses in numbers, it gains in efficiency. And that's the critical difference between knowledge and wisdom and experience and all that. So how the brain modifies itself to actually become more efficient at thinking and acting in the real world is a function of time. And that is where epigenetics is involved in learning itself. Now, assuming that all these stress and all these patterns that we are talking about, which have occurred before 12, are a process of learning, surely we can relearn things or modify that whole learning experience, not just the experience in the experiential term, but the actual biology of that experience, to make changes in that. And that is going to be a focus of a lot of new psychiatry or new efforts that we are trying to understand, because these are processes that we are beginning to get a glimmer of. It could be as simple as making sure that you have the right food, for example. Folate deficiency, vitamin B deficiency alters in the way methylation occurs, and malnutrition and stress therefore produce a double whammy. So making sure that the diet is okay, that the food is nutritious and has vitamins is a small battle won. But equally importantly, the emotional nuancing of the relationships or the situation that you find yourself in is also going to play a difference, because the brain learns only by experience.
Doc, when we were talking about experiences really are our interpretation of what we've taken from an incident or even a person, right? Explain to us how it is possible to rewrite some of the stories.
There are two parts to your statement. One is that what is my experience or what is my personal experience. So what epigenetics or the way the brain adapts to new information can be traced back to the way the brain developed that blueprint in early life. The other aspect is just new learning or constant engagement with the brain. Now, we all know that constant experience alters the brain in any way. So whether you jog or whether you play badminton or you do yoga, you actually feel a sense of calmness and relaxation by doing physical acts. Now, physical activity, for example, is one of the most effective ways to rewire the brain. To constantly expand that plastic capacity by actually doing things that you enjoy, getting a sense of fulfillment, getting a sense of participation or empowerment, actually has a protective effect on mental health. One of the big issues, as you would know from world over, is this whole epidemics of loneliness and depression, which is directly correlated as to how disconnected people feel from the world around them. So suicide rates are typically highest in countries which are the highest HDI index, Human Development Index. Scandinavian countries, Japan, etc. have the highest. So although they are materially well off, the amount of emotional disconnect they may experience is very different. So the point is not the social context. As an individual, the more engaged or the more diverse your involvement in day-to-day life is, the more plastic your brain will be. And it will constantly rewire itself. The issue is to find the appropriate ways of rewiring it. Of course, in certain individuals who need psychiatric help, the presence of a therapist or a psychiatrist helps things along. Our medicines work essentially along the same pathways. But so does exercise and so does lifestyle change. It is not as if it is one at the cost of the other. All these things merge together and then the patients recover.
That's interesting for a psychiatrist to be talking about nutrition and fitness. And this is the message that we want to give you, anybody who's watching. It is never too late to rewire yourself, rewire your brain. And as Dr. Jain says, it alters the way you read your genes, right? Epigenetic changes, and we'll constantly keep reiterating this point over and over and over again. Do not get stuck in your story, right? Get out of it and move on.
That is very, very necessary, because people have sometimes a very wrong idea of genetics. They think it is something that they are destined.
Right.
It's a trajectory that they're destined for.
The child of an alcoholic may be at a high risk of addiction or alcoholism.
Whatever.
But it
is the
depends
but.
on that.
The but is the most important thing.
Yes, yes.
The but is the most important thing.
B-U-T.
Yes, not the double T. To a very large extent, as we've been discussing, the epigenetics, or the way the brain forms and maintains itself, is going to alter. Now, something that may affect you as a child may not affect you as an adult. Now, there is a strong genetic component to addiction behaviors, or to schizophrenia, or to dementia, but all these are still in the range of 3 to 5%. There's nothing; it's nothing higher than that. It is much higher than the general population, but it is not confirmed genetic disease in that sense. So there's a whole role of the environment which comes in. So every disease that we are talking about, like diabetes, hypertension, schizophrenia, addiction, is a complex gene and environment interaction and correlation. Both these things are equally important. So since we cannot alter the genes very much, but we can influence the environment a whole lot, then we must learn what are the changes in the environment that are necessary to change the course of that person's problem.
So you're talking about epigenetics and you're talking about environment.
Yes.
Why is it that two siblings have different responses to the same stimuli?
Well, starting at the base, the genes may be different. Siblings, after all, are only 50% similar to each other. There's a whole lot of variability, and that's the whole evolution issue, because there is diversity inbuilt into all of us. There are no two people who are alike. Even monozygotic twins are most often temperamentally not quite alike. Then there may be more subtle differences. As the child becomes older, these differences in temperament may either provoke or buttress against risk factors. So they can be that's the point where individual differences start coming up. We often see in the families that it's often just suppose they have 3 or 4 children, sometimes for whatever reason that we don't understand, it's one child who is the target of most of the abuse or the violence or the chastisement, and that then produces certain other downstream effects. So it's not as if all siblings perceive the stress in the same way.
Since we are talking about children of alcoholism, what would be the symptoms?
So we do get a lot of people with problems, and typically they are anxiety, depression, inadequate performance in school, with studies, interpersonal relationships, a whole range of problems. And of course, what we call externalizing symptoms, high sensation seeking, pushing the boundaries, getting into disciplinary problems, not obeying, rules of society or the society around them.
So when you discover that your child is depressed or anxious or is showing high-risk behavior, the thing to do is also to take a step back and assess what could have transpired. It's not that child's fault alone, right?
To see, psychiatric workups invariably require a much deeper understanding of the family and the social matrix.
Why is there stigma attached to depression that is actually caused by someone else?
It's very difficult for us to pinpoint the cause of stigma against psychiatry. For psychiatric illnesses, there are 2 issues. One is, of course, is that the diseases themselves are poorly understood. Number 2, and if they are understood, that the old adage of pointing a finger means 3 fingers point back. And then you begin to understand that the social processes are actually to blame. Because if you actually acknowledge that the way we behave with each other is causing illness, now that's a very brave acceptance. And most societies are not brave enough to accept that.
Clearly not ours.
Nowhere in the world, which is why you find that the rates of teenage suicide or young people attempting self-harm are rising all over the world.
The point is, perhaps all families have a little dysfunctionality. The question is how much. Brings me back to the report itself, where it highlights prenatal and childhood adversity, the changes that occur even in the womb.
These are again a question of how far you want to link the dots. So the hospital that I work in, NIMHANS, is basically a large public hospital. We see almost 1,000 people a day for psychiatry related issues, and we admit around I think 8,000 people with addiction related problems a year. Now most of these people are from the lower socioeconomic status, and colleagues of mine have been studying these families for years. So they are poor families. They have higher occurrence of domestic violence because the person is buying a liter or more of spirits a day, and is usually in the lower middle, working class. That means the amount of food available at home is very low. So when the wives are pregnant, they are malnourished, they've been exposed to domestic violence. Many of these people are also smoking. So there's a whole welter of effects which affects right from the antenatal period. And these are the children whom we are now following up. So that's why we are saying that the defects may occur even antenatal.
I have two questions that have come in, and we are not commenting on specific cases, but perhaps, research, because you've done so much of it, perhaps you can try and answer these. This comes in for somebody who has autoimmune disease. She says, I've had unexplained episodic blackouts as a child, and a few years ago was diagnosed with an aggressive form of autoimmune disease. I lost my father when I was in school. He was an alcoholic, and though I don't remember much, what I do remember are memories of drunkenness and slurring and a lot of fighting at home. I have one question. Is there research that indicates that there is a possible link to what I have been through, not for any other reason, but to find some closure as to why I got this illness? But more importantly, what can I do now?
This would be a complex thing to answer, completely in complete detail. But as you would understand from the cortisol response, now cortisol is also the major drug that is used to control autoimmune disease, steroids. So the way the steroids work in the body is anti-inflammatory, and therefore the fact that stress could alter your steroid responses for a particular period of time, it could also reset the immune pathways much the way it has reset the brain pathways. See, the two parts of the body that learn most extensively in a very dynamic way throughout life is the brain and the immune system. The immune system has to tackle all kinds of new chemicals that it encounters, many cases even man-made chemicals which our evolutionary biology has never before encountered, but still it manages to handle that. Now how that learning pattern may get altered, there are studies, I am not personally aware of that field, but there are studies which show that autoimmune disorders also correlate with adverse childhood experiences.
Excessive cortisol production hampers the brain, affects the
affects the
immune system, affects the hormonal balance of the entire body, affects your nervous system.
Yes, so the brain and the nervous system.
What else is left?
No, but because these two processes, the immune pathways and the brain, are very dynamic. So these are processes which have to be kept. They have a whole range of responses, but they should not go beyond those ranges at any point of time. They are meant to be dynamic.
Right.
But when they have spikes one way or the other, that whole rhythm gets disturbed. And that's what creates problems.
Occasional spikes are handleable,
okay. Yes.
But if it happens over a long period of time, that's when...
Then the whole rhythm gets changed.
There's another question that has come in. What are the signs to watch out for in terms of stress and health for her and her sibling, considering parent was an alcoholic and his health completely broke down at all levels, starting from cancer. He suffered multiple ulcers, had cirrhosis of liver, and finally died of a cervical spine dysfunction. Both she and her sibling are teetotalers. Same
Same
explanation.
issue. Yeah, but
But what are the signs to watch out for?
I mean, per se, they don't seem to be having any signs, the person. But typically, depending on the age, the risks of anxiety or exaggerated stress responses, I mean, decision making, or grief responses, or stressful, the way excessive emotionality may come in. So you have to be a bit careful of that. Otherwise, I would not really, if they are teetotalers in that sense, I would not really worry. But control of what we call negative mood states, anxiety, depression, anger, all these things may be a bit different. The reason why this comes in is because a large number of people who do have alcoholism usually find, if you go back, about a third of them have actually self-medicated themselves because they've enjoyed their drink because it helps them control their negative mood states. When they drink, they find that they are more relaxed, they can be more assertive, they feel more confident. So they're using the alcohol initially as a kind of a drug to control mood symptoms. Now, even if you don't drink, those mood symptoms may still occur in the family. So the drinking may just be an add-on effect, but the risk factor of emotional discontrol would still manifest itself.
Emotional
Discontrol.
Very interesting word. Ending with the research, are there any points that you would like to highlight?
The one thing that we would like to emphasize over and over again, that we need to understand these processes over a lifetime. So the issue, as we were discussing earlier, is to understand the ways in which the brain rewires itself, the way the body heals itself, the way processes come back to a regular, healthy pattern. Because as doctors, we are fascinated by disease, but we must understand that 95% of the population is healthy. And therefore, we need to understand how things come back to healthy life. And that process is how we understand epigenetics. So as we get to know more and more, we get to understand what are the networks by which if one goes down, the other one comes up to protect it. And ultimately balance is maintained or regained. And that is the message of medicine in general, specifically in psychiatry. As I mentioned, whether you use drugs or yoga or exercise and counseling, all three ultimately converge on the same processes. And that understanding is very, very important, because otherwise people keep saying only drugs are better, this is better, yoga is the answer for everything. None of that is true. It has to be a multi-pronged effort. It has to involve all aspects of your life. With all that, many of these effects can be mitigated, altered, or even worked through for a more positive outcome.
We'll keep checking in with you on more research done in this area. Thank you very much for joining us on the show.
Pleasure.